Welcome to Green and Gold FC.
And a duel, and they're poked home by Tim Cahill. Australia have done it.
Could write the Matildas into history. Cue the party.
The best team of the A-League era.
And it goes. Tyler! It's a save that means the world to Australia.
Welcome back to Green and Gold FC, the podcast where we dive deep into Australian football. Today we're talking South Melbourne Football Club with two of the most passionate and outspoken voices in the game, South Melbourne Mike and South Melbourne Pete. South Melbourne Mike has never been shy about challenging the powers that be in Australian football. His unfiltered views have earned him his fair share of critics and supporters. Then there's South Melbourne Pete, better known as Four Corners Pete, who is known for shedding light on stories that don't always make it into the mainstream football conversation. In this episode, Mike and Pete share personal stories as we revisit South Melbourne's glory days, the NSL's collapse, and the club's transition into the NPL, and the broader issues facing Australian football. We also look ahead to what the future holds for South Melbourne Football Club. Let's dive in. Hello, Mike. Hello, Pete. And hello, Alex.
Hello, Graham.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hello, Graham.
So I want to introduce, just going back to the glory days of South Melbourne and some of your history, and I want to know, how long have you been South Melbourne fans? What was the first South Melbourne game you remember attending?
Look, I'm happy to start off. Funnily enough, because my grandparents lived in Albert Park, which, is probably only 5 to 10 minutes from Middle Park at the time, and also Lakeside Stadium, my earliest memory is like maybe when I was 3, 4, 5 years of age, saying to my father that I don't want to go to the game. I just remember he always really wanted to take me to watch football, and, being a young kid, I would push back. So that's my earliest memory, but the earliest memory that I have of an actual game, I was thinking about it, it's probably the 1990 grand final. I just remember going there and didn't really remember that much about the game aside from that South Melbourne won. But as a young, impressionable kid, just remember being like in a really packed, Olympic Park. I have vivid memories of my father driving me regularly to Olympic Park. There was a large car park at the time. There was maybe a 5 or 10 minute walk to the stadium. But that one game in particular, which is quite a famous game where South Melbourne didn't play too well, but, there was reportedly over 20,000 people there. I think we even heard as much as 23,000. Really left an impression on me. So, yeah, that's my answer, Graham.
How about you, Pete? What was your first game and what was the atmosphere like?
I'm a little bit older than Mike's. My father equally took me to my first game in the early 80s. I think it was 1980 or 81. But I didn't hesitate. I wanted to go and instantly fell in love with just the game, first and foremost, because just seeing these athletes participating on the ground and seeing their skills and being in the crowd and watching them and just being part of that atmosphere. And I just immediately fell in love with it. I remember the next day going to my best mate's place and telling him all about it and, play by play. And it was an instant love affair for me. We won 4-1, and I remember the chants of Hellas and the stands rocking and, the trumpet going off. And it just was like an instant drug for me. And, 45 years later, I still have that same feeling. And similar to Ange and his story, my dad used to work night shifts and things like that. And on Sundays was the one day that I got to properly spend with my dad. And it's some funny times back in the day.
Yeah. And I think, gents, it's worth noting, both Peter and I mentioned, like our fathers. And I think that's what, for our generation, it cuts really personal, like it's something that, we were doing with our fathers. We were going regularly to watch football. They took us under their wing. We really grew our love for the game together. Even today, unfortunately, my father is still alive. We still go together to as many matches as we can, hopefully every match this season. And yeah, like it's an experience it's very hard to let go of, So yeah, maybe that explains some of our passion towards the club.
So I actually don't know whether either of you are Greek descent, but is South Melbourne's known as having a strong connection to the Greek community. Was that true in your experience?
Yeah, for me it was, and it was very strong Greek connection. Mike and I both have Greek heritage. And I guess but it started predominantly from our father's generation. That generation built the club from scratch, and the community, the Greek community in Melbourne, really got behind the club, and as they did around Heidelberg as well. And it was a big part of the community. And every family function you had, you'd talk about the game and about the signings we were going to have and so forth. So all the other people in the Greek community that you knew, all supporting one team or the other. But I'm also an Essendon Football Club supporter, right? And I don't love South Melbourne because of its Greek heritage. I love South Melbourne because it's my club. The same way I like my AFL club because it's my club. And over time, like my kids, they're not 100% Greek. They're second generation best. They don't come to the games because it's a Greek club. The club's evolved, right? The same way that, again, the AFL clubs revolved around some of the Christian community groups. They've evolved over time as well. And whilst the clubs will always have that connection to the Greek community or any other community they're from, it's not what defines them fully, right? They're football clubs first and foremost, and people support the clubs because they are connected to the club from a football sense and a community second.
Yeah, and look, what I can add to what Peter just said is, the reality was, gents, 60, 70, 80 years ago, with the big migrant boom in Australia, that's what basically made football in this country in terms of, sustaining it in terms of a league system, as far as I'm aware. When I was growing up, we had to deal, for example, at high school, I'm not sure if kids experience it now. I look at my kids and they never mention, for example, being sort of vilified for playing football or soccer, whatever you prefer to call it. But that was very real when I was going to school. There's a reason why Johnny Warren released a book called Shillers, Wogs and Poofters. Sorry to use that terminology, but, I don't know if that book would work now, right? Because I just think the acceptance of the game is far larger. And it's to what we were saying, I think, primarily before the podcast, football is everywhere. And I think the internet has really helped. Streaming services have helped. Video games have helped. It's very difficult to avoid football. We didn't have that 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And we were pigeonholed as, some sort of ethnic sport. We hate using the term wogball, but it was used. And, it led to a book from Johnny Warren called Shillers, Wogs and Poofters. That's not the environment we are here today. But, that's the origin story of clubs like South Melbourne, who the reality was pretty much many clubs, 7, 8, 9 out of 10 clubs were like this. There were offshoots of an ethnic generation that had migrated to the country. That's largely a story of Australia. So I don't think it's something that we should look at as a disadvantage or something that's incorrect about our game here.
I went and watched the Boston Celtics play, and there were Irish flags everywhere, and really proud of the Irish connection to the franchise. And it was bittersweet because why can't we celebrate the origins, or why can't most people celebrate the origins of these clubs? Why is the ethnic roots, or let's not call it ethnic, the migrant roots of these clubs, why is it frowned upon and not celebrated? That is Australia, right? We are a very multicultural country. The migrants built and developed football in this country from near nothing and grew it, through the first ever National Football League in 1977, right? The AFL didn't start, and there wasn't until the Sydney Swans came in. There wasn't a Sydney team in the VFL, and the AFL didn't properly start until the late 80s, early 90s. Same as NRL. So these clubs were really out on a limb. They really grew the game from nothing, and from that built the golden generation, the Socceroos you saw in 2006, and the game at large. If it wasn't for these people that came, a lot of them without an education, to develop these clubs from nothing, where would football be today? It would not be anywhere near where it is today, because it really, they built the game from the ground up. So why can't we celebrate it? Why does it have to be the ethnics versus the non-ethnic clubs? Why can't it just be football?
And gents, because Peter has put it really well, this is one of the reasons why, on platforms like X, obviously formerly known as Twitter, we point out, when the mainstream media, funnily enough today, is picking on, for example, A-League violence outside the stadium, because we were told, or we certainly got the impression, that one of the reasons why the A-League was formed was to avoid these sort of incidents, when in reality, sure, some of them in the past may have been fueled by ethnicity, but the reality is, when you take ethnicity out of it, it is still happening. It's still individuals who basically want to go to a stadium or outside of the stadium to cause trouble. Actually, it's evolved to a point where it's actually got nothing to do with ethnicity, in my opinion. Right. We've seen, for example, the mainstream media. It's just my personal belief that, in the era of the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, when we didn't really have the internet, we didn't have, the ability to spread information via social media so quickly, that the mainstream media, i.e., the broadcast channels, the main newspapers, they viewed football, soccer, whatever you prefer to call it, as a threat. So one of their strategies was to pick on ethnicity. And unfortunately, there were some people who claimed to be football fans, I'm sure they are, and they still use this point, even though, in my opinion, it was largely created in the mainstream media by, opponents of football. They still use this point as some sort of bad element of football. Yes, there are incidents, or there have been incidents which are based on ethnicity. They are extremely rare. In fact, today, they are almost invisible in state league football. I'm sure, it's never mentioned at an A-League level. So we can almost say it's entirely invincible, say over the last 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years, maybe even longer, actually, because I can say hand on heart, when I was going to watch, South Melbourne in the NSL, I chose not to participate in anything that would cause such an incident. I saw very few incidents, and it was always a similar pattern. It was individuals who wanted to go to a stadium or outside of the stadium to cause trouble. And you know what? 20, 25 years later, we still see the same situation today. So I personally think it's almost a tragedy that, we had people inside and outside of football. Okay, can sort of understand the motivations of people outside of football picking on this one topic to try bring the game down, but the people inside of football focusing on this topic, I think is a big tragedy because, as we've mentioned, South Melbourne, other clubs like Melbourne Knights, Marconi, Sydney Olympic, Heidelberg, we can keep bringing them off. These are clubs with supporter bases, infrastructure, history, and we've said they're basically not good enough because they were founded, by migrants, which doesn't sit well with me.
I will just say as well, a big issue that I've been, noticing, especially with a lot of the discourse around, the NSD coming in and stuff like that, is that a lot of people are sort of divided on that issue of whether or not it's actually a good thing to have those sort of ethnic-based clubs. And, growing up in WA and around football here, I can honestly say that some of the, most inclusive clubs and some of, the best atmosphere for clubs I've been around are clubs that have those ethnic bases, whether it would be Florida Athena with their Greek heritage, whether it would be clubs like Balcata Etna with their Italian heritage. So it's honestly surprising to me that we're still seeing this argument brought up by a lot of people that, it's not inclusive or it's not a good idea to have these ethnic-based clubs because it's going to lead to conflict, when this conflict is always going to exist, like you said, Mike. So I'm genuinely curious as to what your thoughts are with the NSD eventually coming up. Do you think it's going to be sort of something that these clubs are going to try and tap into, more of those heritage-based markets, whether it be Adelaide City? We saw that they finally were allowed to add the Italian flag back to their emblem. Would that be something that you're expecting these clubs to sort of tap into? And, including South Melbourne with their obvious Greek heritage, is that something you want to see? Or would you be looking for them to sort of move more into the future where they're trying to tap into other markets?
Personally, I think it's everyone's choice. It's every club's choice. How a club chooses to promote itself should be entirely their choice. Now, there are obvious links to these clubs and their community. And I'll use Preston as the example. Preston has a huge community in that northern suburbs of Melbourne, and they know they can tap into that community and get a crowd of 4, 5, 6,000 people, right? And good on them. Why not? You know what? All those people going to the Preston games are Australian, first and foremost, right? No matter what they identify as or otherwise, they're all Australian. And they're all Australian football fans, and they're going to the football to watch their club. And if a club wants to identify with a certain community group, they should be allowed to. How they choose to grow their club is entirely up to them. Now, that might limit their fan base. It might help them grow their fan base. It'll be on a case-by-case basis. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't say you can't or you shouldn't or that you should. It's really up to each club. Our club, South Melbourne, is always going to be known as Hellas, right? The logo has some clear links to the Greek flag. But the people that go to the games, they're not all of Greek origin. And a lot of them aren't. Not all of them. A lot of them aren't. And some of our biggest fans come from a whole range of demographics, from the local community, from the juniors, from the wider Albert Park area. And as I said earlier, I'm of Greek origin. That's not why I love South Melbourne. I love South Melbourne because it's my football club. And it might have introduced me to the club in the first place, but it's not, I got introduced to a lot of things, And the other part of it is, people love the food and the culture of these places. Well, we'll tap into it. I love going to the Knight Stadium and getting chavapi, right? And I love going to some of the clubs of Greek origin and getting a souvlaki. And, that's part of the culture of football. It's part of the diverse Australia. And let's not sanitize everything. Let clubs be what they need to be and let them grow in a way. And if it's failing for them, guess what? They won't raise the money. They won't be relevant and they won't be able to compete in a second division. So really, whatever works for each club should just be allowed to do what they need to do, and the rest will work itself out.
I can share a couple of examples, right, just to give context to what Peter was saying. So at South Melbourne, I would say in the last 20 years, I rarely saw a Greek flag, right? Ironically, in the last probably 2 or 3 years, I've seen a Greek flag re-emerge at the games. Why I say ironically is because that Greek flag is brought to the stadium by an English gentleman called William or Bill. I won't reveal his surname. And the trumpeter, who unfortunately can't come to matches that often, I believe he lives in regional Victoria, but he does come, for big matches. The trumpeter is actually of Portuguese origin, right? So what these people have in common is a love of football. They have found this love of football can be fulfilled at a historic club like South Melbourne, who I believe offers a football sort of feeling of, like a traditional sort of football club that's high performing. It's fortunate for South Melbourne that we have a lot of success and we're still able to, at the moment, maintain that success. But to Alex's original point and to what Peter echoed, I think it's incumbent on all these clubs with a background to find the balance of, how much should they lean in to their origins and how much they sort of don't, right? Like it's up to them. It's based on their research. It's based on what their supporter base wants. But I'll leave you with this one example before we move on to the next question. If I lived in Broadmeadows, right, and I love football to the same capacity that I do now. So Broadmeadows is in the region of Hume or the municipality of Hume. And I had no existing football club to support, but I really love football to the same level that I do now. I foresee that I wouldn't have an issue supporting Hume City if they were the biggest team near me. Yes, I understand they have a Turkish background, but when I visit Hume City these days, I really enjoy the experience there. They have a nice stadium, their service is always top notch. They have they usually have a strong team. It's a good football experience. I don't go there to cause trouble and be in the face of Hume City supporters, with topics which are not football related, right? So, the point I'm making is, I think this topic, I personally feel it's overplayed and it's up to clubs to decide, how much they leverage it or not. In Peter's example of Preston, it works amazingly well for them, but it's up to each club to make a decision as to how they pursue marketing themselves.
Let's move on to South Melbourne's glory days. During the NSL era, South Melbourne was so dominant. What made them so dominant?
I'm happy to kick this off. Look, I thought about this and I would say, even though I was I was only a year old, so that gives away my age, when we won in 84, I looked at our coaches, right? So we won in 1984 under Len McKendry, who's considered like, a top coach in Victorian football and probably Australian football. And, South Melbourne released a short video actually on the 1984 side, and you see some players, including Alan Davidson, who's Jason Davidson's father, talking about, his time in that 84 team and under Len McKendry. We then had Pushkas, who, arguably, look, he had relative success as a coach. Obviously, at South Melbourne, he was absolutely successful. You could say that, again, like a big coaching figure. Then before the Postecoglou era, which, defines itself with 2 championship wins, we had Frank Arrock, the year before we had Ange Postecoglou. And I really remember Frank Arrock, who's obviously, a legend of the Australian coaching scene. And, obviously he's passed away, but he's still fondly remembered. I remember whilst South Melbourne was very poor in that year on the ladder, and he blooded a lot of young players. And that fell like just perfectly into the lap of Ange Postecoglou, who took these talented young team and, obviously added his own touch and brought in some players himself. But he went on to win 2 consecutive championships. So in short, my answer would be, one of the big elements of our success has been always having these, these strong coaches associated with a club. Don't want to harp on the point too much, but, even someone like Joe Montemuro, who's obviously, done tremendously well in women's football. Now, he's coached in many places, but I remember in the earlier years of our time in the Victorian Premier League, it may have been, 5 or 6 or 7 years in when we had Peter Talakis as coach. The assistant coach was Joe Montemuro. I believe he won a championship with our under-21 side. That's, for me, like, aside from, the unbelievable support that South Melbourne had when they were playing well and, the passionate atmosphere in the stadium, I would say, the strong coaches is one of the reasons why we performed really well.
I would add to that as well. We came into the NSL in 77 off the back of a very dominant period in the Victorian state leagues. So South Melbourne was a very strong club through the 60s and 70s and really had a lot of momentum and a lot of big demanding support base, right? And demanding is the word, right? We just demanded success. I remember when we weren't winning, there was a lot of pressure on the coaches, right? Like, after the game, people would wait around to, let the coach know that he wasn't meeting the expectations of the club. And that expectation filtered from the fans to the boardroom to the playing field, right? We just expected to win, right? And it was just that a winning culture and nothing else but a good playing team winning championships was appropriate. And you said in the Puskas documentary, Puskas was, having the team close to the top of the table, but the fans were still demanding him that he play better football, that he play this certain player, that we win this game. And it's a real culture of winning football and good, attractive football.
I think, Peter, he raises a great point. I'll just add another point. I'm sorry to interject. Like, even today, for example, in the NPL Victoria, I guess, in the vibe of this conversation, it wouldn't surprise many, but, there is similar pressure on the coach to perform. Even though, for example, the coach has something like a 75 to 80% win record, which is ridiculous over the past 3 years, there's always a period of, we want to do better, we haven't won this trophy. We've lost the grand final a few years in a row. There's just this ongoing pressure, which I think it's rooted in high performance in football. Again, it's totally separate from being an ethnic club. It's got nothing to do with the ethnic background of the club. It's all got to do with performing at a high level on the football pitch. So yeah, that's the point I wanted to add.
So I'll start with Pete for the next question. Are there any specific players, coaches, or matches that stand out as defining moments?
Oh, so many. Probably the match that I remember the most was the big game. I think it was a Thursday night against Perth Glory in 1999. It was a packed out crowd, great atmosphere, and I think we won 2-1. It was a real close contest, and the place was just buzzing like I've never seen it before. It was a big victory, and off the back of that, we ended up finishing in the top 2 on the table, which then led to us winning the championship if we hadn't finished in the top 2. And then, of course, because of that, we ended up qualifying for the Club World Cup the following year. And if I look back at that game and the importance of that game, and both from a result where we finished on the table and what it led to, that's a pivotal moment, I think, in the club's history. In terms of players, oh my goodness, so many great players. But Paul Chimboli's everyone's favourite, right? Like he's a god to anyone of my generation. And not only because he was a unbelievably great player, he was the heart and soul of the club, an absolute gentleman, a great person who I got to meet and got to know a little bit in my time at the club, and skills that just we've rarely seen in this country. So yeah, I think a combination of that game and the legend that is Paul Chimboli, should be a statue of him out the front of Lakeside, if you ask me. One right next to Ange and Ference, but no, they're probably the two pivotal, game and person.
Yeah, in terms of the games which I remember, it's interesting because, I don't know, for some reason, I tend to lean towards, the game against Carlton, where I guess it was more around, obviously, South Melbourne, won that grand final. We had Komputsianis scoring what we thought was the sealer to put us 2 goals ahead. And then, the goal was called back. And then Carlton, whilst the South Melbourne players were still celebrating, almost went up the other end and scored, which would have equalised the game. And then obviously, the aftermath of that game was Komputsianis was on the front page of the Herald Sun, being involved in an unfortunate incident, outside of football, obviously. So that's one in my mind that remains present. Also because Carlton, was an experiment. It was a team, basically born from AFL Footy Club. They'd invested in putting together a strong team. And, it was kind of like the old versus the new guard, and yet South Melbourne won that match. And, I mentioned Komputsianis. He's definitely a player who I feel, if he was around in today's times, with platforms like YouTube, and, it's worth mentioning, I think South Melbourne has put together a compilation of Komputsianis. I mean, I honestly feel this guy's free kick taking ability and also his corner kick taking ability at the time was in the top 10 in the world, but no one would have known it. Unless you were a South Melbourne fan, there was no way to spread that information at scale. Obviously, that would be totally different now, but his ability to swing in corners, in a way which I don't even see now. We're talking about, just curling the ball viciously towards the keeper, just perfectly designed for just that flick on headers. It was just unbelievable. I just remember seeing it as a, as a teenager, corner after corner, he was putting it, into these areas. And of course, his free kicks were, just outstanding. And then, I'll also mention a player who, didn't play for South Melbourne, but for me, he remains, the absolute best player I've ever seen in Australian football. I mean, his achievements at such a young age and also his achievements in Europe, I guess, speak all the words you need to know, but that's Mark Viduka, a player who, there was a famous, I think, preliminary final, Olympic Park, South Melbourne versus the Melbourne Knights. It was a wet evening, so that's another game that sticks out in my mind. He had 3 chances. That's all the chances Melbourne Knights had. He took them. Komputsianis scored 2, but Melbourne Knights won the match 3-2. He was just sensational. To be under, 21 years of age and to be the top scorer of the league twice, the under 21 player of the year twice, the player of the year twice. This is something which I think will struggle to repeat. And I think we should probably ask questions as to why we can't find another player like Mark Viduka. It's probably, approaching 30 years since he made his mark on Australian football, and we haven't had anyone remotely close to him. So that's my answer.
Now, obviously, you mentioned Mark Viduka. Look, easily one of the greatest Australian players of all time. Maybe not one of the greatest performers in a Socceroo jersey, as I'm sure a lot of people would say. But a lot of the sort of best memories that I'm sure a lot of Australian football fans would have would be of that golden generation, sort of in and around 2006 and just before in the early 2000s. So what sort of role do you think that, I guess, the old NSL had to do with creating that golden generation? Obviously, we had the likes of Bresciano, Muscat, Viduka, as you just mentioned, and, many more Australian, I guess, representatives coming through the NSL in that time. How important do you really think the NSL structure was to creating that sort of golden generation that we saw?
Was everything. And if you ask John Aloisi, he speaks about it really well, how he grew up around Adelaide City and he just felt part of the club, right? And he grew up at the club and was nurtured all the way through. And we go back to what I was saying before. These are football clubs first and foremost. They're not here to make a profit for any shareholders. They were football clubs. Every dollar they earned, everything they did was around making their club better and producing players and winning games. And when you grow up around these clubs that are just purely about football, that's what you get. So I was fortunate enough to see all these players come through the system. And I lived through an era where we went from importing players, predominantly, say, Scottish, English backgrounds, to starting to produce our own. So roughly from the late 80s onwards, we really started producing our own great Socceroos, the Alan Davidsons, the Peter Catholicis, the Mark Vidukas, and so forth. And these clubs just nurtured these players from a very young age, from their junior systems all the way through. Now, the money wasn't necessarily there to be able to go and buy players from other leagues and so forth. So really, we had to develop our own. And because that football culture that these clubs had and the quality of players that were coming through and the quality of the coaches we had in the system back then really helped produce some fantastic players. And you saw these players just appear out of nowhere, whether they were Ned Zelic or Swartzer or whoever it may be. We really had a culture of developing and giving opportunities to young players to play. We didn't just go and buy a B-grade player from Asia or South America. We actually invested in our own. And it's actually interesting now that the A-League's having a lot of problems, that they're starting to realise that actually, why don't we just produce our own players and make a profit by selling them on, right? And really, that's what the game should be doing. We should be developing our own Australian talent by having opportunities and, whether it be at NST or top flight football, having a culture of developing from a young age good players, giving them opportunities at the highest level possible. It should be part of the game today, and we can learn a lot of what these clubs did through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s and the ability to produce the Mark Vidukas and the Ned Zeliches of the world, because there was many of them. It wasn't just Mark Viduka. And even before that golden generation, there were many players, whether, as I said, Alan Davidson or Peter Katholis or Charlie Yankos. These were homegrown Socceroos that played in Europe and really carried the Socceroos badge and really did well throughout their whole career. And it wasn't just one generation, it was multiple generations over time.
I just want to say that's, I think, one thing that, whether you're a person that valued the old system of the NSL over the A-League, or whether you're someone that prefers the modernization of the A-League, I think we can all agree that the production of Australian youngsters should always come first for these clubs. And I like the fact that, A-League clubs are ambitious and trying to, have success in Asia and, getting all these marquees and stuff like that. But I do feel like, especially, before the last couple of years, before you saw the likes of Marco Tilio, Garen Qual, Nesri Rinkunda, like we really were taking a back seat on youth production. And I'm really, really happy that we're starting to see the fruits of, our labor with, multi-million-dollar deals for players like Hayden Matthews, Joe Gauci, the aforementioned Nestor Irankunda and Garen Qual. So I definitely feel like that's one sort of thing that we took from the old NSL that I'm really, really happy that is starting to, I guess, show its head again in Australian football. And that's that sort of trust that we're starting to put in the young players. Mike, I'll let you touch on Peter's point just there. But I guess just to add to that, what are some extra added values that you feel the NSL held that the modern day A-League don't hold when it comes to progressing, I guess, the careers and the, I guess, just trusting youth players more? What do you think are some things that we should be doing or we should be learning from our successes in the past in the NSL?
Look, funnily enough, it comes down to those two words, football culture. So whilst football, may not have been as popular because, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have obviously the popularity of video games wasn't as, high as it is now. The participation rate was lower. Football culture, in my opinion, for those involved in the game was significantly stronger. So that led to an ecosystem where, yes, young players were promoted. We had the AIS. We had a national youth league. It wasn't perfect, but still, even in the NSL, there was a national youth league. But really at an individual level, like, these players, I remember being a young kid and listening to their interviews. They would say, I would go as a junior player, into the car with my father after having a bad match, and he would talk to me nonstop about the game. He would criticize me. This to me, like, whether you agree with this approach or not, I'm not saying it's the best way, but it just indicates like a level of football culture, which is, it's basically not the same now. We can talk about young players going overseas in the A-League now. Sure, it's happening, but, I'm seeing players, for example, who are leaving to go overseas after 10 or 15 games. Like I remember a player like Brett Emerton, he played, I felt like he played like 3 or 4 seasons in the NSL. I could be wrong there, but there was many players who spent 1, 2, 3 seasons, got 30, 40, 50, 60 games under their belt, maybe even more before they went to overseas. And back then, like obviously the professionalism of the game in terms of how deep professional football was, for example, maybe playing in the championship would have still been a good achievement, but League One, League Two, you wouldn't really see that much of a transfer to a league like that. It would be basically like players going to the English Premier League, or to a high league like the Serie A in the case of Grella and Bresciano. Actually, we had an ecosystem to the point where players like Harry Kewell, maybe even Timmy Cahill is part of this example as well. Lucas Neal, they could go to England directly, trial, and get into a reasonable level, especially in Harry Kewell's case, straight to Leeds United from Australia without even playing in the NSL. Like, we do see some players obviously now going to academy teams, in England, but that whole structure is more fleshed out. There's more opportunities. So I would say what we can learn from the NSL, Alex, is that, and actually we can't turn it on overnight, but we need to start focusing on football culture, what it takes to produce an environment that, the people involved are living and breathing football, and over many years, if we really build that sort of environment, I think we can one day again have a golden generation. But it's not going to happen straight away.
The football culture also comes with more clubs and more opportunities. Now, in the NSL days, it was clubs like Sunshine George Cross. Now, Sunshine George Cross were not the most successful club, but I tell you what, they produced some damn good players. John Markowski, Paul Trimboli, Kevin Muscat, just to name a few. Now, obviously, we can't just do that readily overnight, but what we can do is have a national second division so that actually there's more opportunities for players, because some kids take a little bit longer to develop and sometimes they need to go through, let's say, a less successful club to get an opportunity. It happens the world over, right? So if there's not opportunities, once kids get to 18, 19 years old and there isn't that next appropriate level for them, then they're either lost to the system or they're playing at an even lower level and not really developing. So we need to find a way to nurture that talent. If they're not finding their way into a professional setup and getting opportunities, there should be some other opportunities to fall back on to grow again. And we've seen by giving kids opportunities, what can occur. So really at the end of the day, we need those more opportunities. And in today's environment, they don't just need to be in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane or, all the major cities. Why not create opportunities in regional areas through the national second tier or in places like Tasmania and places like that? So there is actually a program or a process where you can start off as a junior in, say, at South Hobart and progress to the point that then if South Hobart was in the national second division, could play in that, and then they could be picked up by a first division club or go overseas. Because right now, a Tasmanian kid would have to move to the mainland to get an opportunity. So we need more clubs, more strong clubs, more opportunities for players to get the best out of the system.
And just one point that I'll add as well, like around the structure, I think that's a big problem as well, which is very difficult to, adapt to the NSL, because we now have, like basically a private, largely foreign owned, franchise system that's geared towards looking after shareholders, right? Whereas back in the NSL, whether it was semi-pro, whether it was part-time, whatever you want to call it, all those clubs were geared towards delivering like football outcomes. That was their number one goal, to basically win things or to produce players. Whatever their target was, it was related around football. Unfortunately now, in the highest league in Australia, you can't replicate that because you have goals which are not geared towards that. They're geared towards, whatever the shareholders want. And we don't know really what their involvement is driven by. That's an unfortunate byproduct, I think, of the A-League, but it gives us an opportunity, hopefully with a national second tier, especially a home and away league second tier that's connected to all other tiers of the Australian football pyramid. We can once again have clubs at a high national level whose main purpose for existence and being really is for football outcomes, right? So from that perspective, I think the NSD is absolutely vital.
I want to move on towards probably South Melbourne's highest point. They made the Club World Cup. Pete, what was that like? Did you have any memories of the Club World Cup that stood out to you?
Oh, geez. So many memories. I actually went to the Club World Cup and I wasn't going to go because I had another trip planned later that year. But when the draw came out that two of my clubs were going to play against each other at the Maracana, I just couldn't not go. So I was fortunate enough to get on a plane on the 1st of January 2000. Mid-flight, turned back into 1999, and those old enough to know the Y2K bug. The plane didn't fall over, so that was okay. I'm still alive. Get into the Maracana, and it was just, everything was amazing. That first game against Vasco da Gama, we were in a bus heading to the stadium, and there was a lot of people putting up 10 fingers at us, and it wasn't two high fives. It was them telling us how much they thought Vasco were going to beat South Melbourne by, and the Maracana had about 65, 70,000 people there, and the atmosphere was electric. In fact, Manchester United played the curtain raiser against Necaxa before a South Melbourne game. Now, stop and think about that. Manchester United played a curtain raiser to a South Melbourne game, the Manchester United of that 2099 era. And I remember talking to the Man United fans after the game, and they said the atmosphere for the Vasco South Melbourne game was the best they'd seen anywhere in the world. So atmosphere was electric. We got to halftime. It was 0-0. And you could see the fear on the Brazilians' faces thinking, oh my goodness, we might not beat this little team from Australia. And eventually in the second half, they scored. And I was obviously gutted because, we considered a score. And then I looked up and I started laughing because I'm looking at seeing all these Vasco fans going absolutely crazy because they scored a goal against South Melbourne, right? And I had to laugh, right? Because it was just the most surreal moment of my life, or one of the most surreal football moments of my life. And then obviously we lost 2-0 and scored a goal against Necaxa, lost 3-1. The players were gutted after that because they really fancied their chances against Necaxa. And then the final game was against Manchester United. So I was not a Manchester United supporter that day. I was 110% Man United. And we conceded a couple of goals, but I'll never forget Vaughan Coveney coming off the bench. And we always knew Vaughan Coveney, for those of my era, was really a fast player, but you never knew who to compare him against. And I'll never forget him just running past the Man United players and them just looking shocked at how fast he was. And then he got through one-on-one with the keeper, shoots a goal, hits the left goal post, rolls across the line, hits the right goal post and goes out. And Paul Vaughan Coveney still talks about it today, about the moment that he nearly scored against Manchester United. So, and after the game, I used to write for the Matchday program back in the day, and it was before the time we all had cameras on our phones. And Ange looked at me and did the sort of a finger pointing like, have you got a camera with you? And I shook my head, and he was gutted because there was the shot of the century there. There would have been a potential opportunity to take a photo of a joint press conference between Sir Alex and Ange, and no one ever got a photo of that moment. But I was there. I was there for it. And just talking about it just brings back such amazing memories. And, we thought we would be there again and again. And, we all know what happened a few years later. And I cherish those 2 weeks of my life, more than anything from a football sense. It was quite remarkable.
What Manchester United players were there, just to bring us all back?
David Beckham, Clinton Fortune, Roy Keane, Gary Cole. It was the 1999 treble team that was playing. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. I can't remember the exact lineup, but I remember Fortune scored a couple of goals, and David Beckham played in that game as well. So we had the Neville brothers. It wasn't a weak team, right? You're talking about part-time players from Australia versus these footballing gods, really, as they are today. And it was just surreal. And I was fortunate enough to have a press pass and to go to see all the teams train on the Maracana and to, go to the press conferences and so forth. And Michael Lynch was there as well, covering it, staying at the same hotel as us. Michael, I'm sorry, but Michael really enjoyed the buffet breakfast, I noticed. I know that we're there, we'll have a bit of a giggle about that. But we had a great time. And by day, we were swimming on the Copacabana. And by night, we were going and watching games at the Maracana. It's pinch yourself type moments.
Yeah, and in all honesty, there's not much more I can add to what Peter said because unfortunately I didn't attend, but I watched all the matches on TV. The only thought that I can add is I remember, this was a new tournament at the time, and obviously South Melbourne was trying to qualify for it. They needed to go to Fiji, and I think Ange recently, in one of his press conferences for Tottenham, has mentioned how I think in the final how the pitch may have had like frogs on it, but. I wasn't in Fiji at the time, but I remember listening. I mean, the only coverage we had, because again, there was no sort of, really the internet was not providing, radio streaming or any sort of like video-based streaming of this match. So it was basically the 3XY team, which is, for those not familiar with 3XY, it's basically a Greek radio station here in Victoria. It's been going for over 30 years. They went to Fiji and they were providing, a radio broadcast. I remember listening to those matches and I expected South Melbourne to absolutely cakewalk those matches. But I guess it was a combination of maybe the environment that we were playing in. It was hot. The pitch wasn't ideal. Just a combination of those unfamiliar conditions. I remember, being quite nervous. We made it quite a difficult thing to qualify for the tournament. But then, when we eventually got to the tournament, just watching it on TV, I just remember thinking, wow, this is insane. Like, and then seeing South Melbourne, a team that was training part-time, basically compete with these clubs, in particular the game against Vasco da Gama, which, wow, they had players like Romario and Edmundo. We're talking about, players who, leading the line for Brazil, and South Melbourne only lost 2-0 in a packed Maracana, like a part-time team. I think, again, that speaks to, the football culture at the time for a team to be able to go there and not embarrass themselves, and they were a part-time team. It's just a memory that I wouldn't forget. It is a bit of a shame that, we don't sort of collectively talk about, these sort of parts of Australian football, in a way which would reflect a togetherness, I guess. This is like a rich part or a rich era of Australian football. And it's kind of like, it's basically not really talked about. But those are my memories, in particular, winning the matches in Fiji and listening to it on a poor sort of radio feed. And then, once we got to Brazil, it was sensational to watch on TV.
I'm not talking about our history and when things moved on. Let's talk about how things moved on from there. We'll talk about the fall of the NSL and the rise of the A-League. Mike, what was your reaction when the NSL folded and South Melbourne was not included in the A-League?
Yeah, look, I struggled to think exactly, the way I felt at the time. But one thing I do remember is I really am indebted and appreciate the efforts of those people who, worked to basically, ensure that South Melbourne continued, because, that wasn't a foregone conclusion. Money had to be raised. The Victorian Premier League at the time didn't want to transition, South Melbourne into the Victorian Premier League immediately. So there was a period of no football for South Melbourne. Imagine being a business, that's reliant on operating in a certain environment. And all of a sudden, that's basically, it's pulled away from you. I think any business operating in this sort of environment, and you can compare that, to what happened to South Melbourne, would struggle to survive. So it's not only South Melbourne, it's basically all the clubs who were involved in the NSL who had this sort of situation occur to them. It was a very difficult time. Again, as mentioned, I was very indebted to those people who basically rallied around the community, raised money, kept the club going. But as the years have gone on, I certainly do feel that, what a missed opportunity for Australian football to allow 27 years of history, especially some historic clubs. And it's not only South Melbourne, it's Melbourne Knights, Sydney Olympic, it's Marconi, it's Adelaide City, it's other clubs which I haven't mentioned, who still are performing in their national Premier Leagues as strong clubs. They've grown now to have, larger junior wings. They have women's programs. Their infrastructure is large because they've played at a national league level. To basically rug pull them out of the top tier of Australian football, with connotations of new football versus old soccer and football, but not as you know it, which in my opinion, I interpret as being overtly racist. Really, I think that's my view of it. So over the years, that built up, frustration and anger that, as a game, we allowed that to happen to us. Instead of, for example, choosing to build the A-League on the foundations of the NSL, perhaps we could have had 5 or 6 of the strongest NSL clubs, irrespective of their background, plus, new teams from the A-League. And I think that probably would have been the best situation. But my feeling has evolved over the years. It's gone from surprise to frustration to anger to, what a missed opportunity for the game.
What I would add to that as well is that I don't see the NSL through rose-coloured glasses. It folded for a reason and it needed change, right? And a lot of clubs, including South Melbourne, supported the change at the time. But they literally threw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Did it need radical change? Yes. Were there certain inherent problems with the league at the time? Absolutely. Wouldn't have, as I said, wouldn't have folded. And okay, they didn't do it in the first instance, which I think they should have, as to Mike said, I totally agree that we should have had a few of the NSL teams and people could have chosen, right? Some people say they didn't feel welcome at some of the traditional clubs. Okay, you go support Victory or Sydney or whoever it may be. And people can choose, right? Don't monopolise the game. Okay, that's the decision they made. But they've had ample opportunities to reunite the game over time. And here we are, so over 20 years later, and we're still having this conversation. Why? Why can't we grow the game by bringing the old and the new together? And ultimately that should happen through promotion and relegation. That is the fairest way to do it. But there's been ample opportunities to find ways to bring in the clubs like Adelaide City, South Melbourne, Sydney Olympic, Marconi, whoever it may be, into the league and grow the game that way, rather than this soulless money-making approach to football. That's not football culture. That's not growing the game. That's just running it like a business. And football, yes, has to be run like a business in some aspects, but not all aspects of football needs to be run like a business. The people are passionate about their club. So how many people have walked away from the game because we failed to connect, let's just say, old football with new football? We don't know that number, but we know it ain't working either. So there's been so many opportunities to do it. And we've had, what I think, I agree with Mike, some discriminatory approaches from Football Australia, racial discrimination to be clear, in keeping clubs like South Melbourne, Melbourne Knights, so forth, out of the top flight football. And it need not have been that way. And if we're really going to grow the game in Australia, we need everyone who loves the game supporting the game. We don't need to us versus them. We need everyone behind the game. And doesn't mean I'm ever going to like any of the A-League clubs. It doesn't mean any of the fans of the A-League clubs need to like my club. But you know what? That builds rivalry, it builds interest. And that's one of the reasons we like the Australia Cup, because it gives us that. And until we have a united game, we are going nowhere. We're going to continue making the same mistakes we've made for the last 20 years.
Yeah, and gents, I'll add this example, right? Like maybe you think it's an unrealistic example, but I think it's a fair example. Now, if a club like Real Madrid was, for example, found itself, outside of La Liga and had no opportunity to go back into La Liga and no opportunity to play in the UEFA Champions League, which, as we know, Real Madrid is the king of the UEFA Champions League, right? If they had those two fundamental elements taken away from them, I put it to you that they're not Real Madrid really anymore, because in 20 or 30 years' time, I think that they will basically fold almost, because they won't be able to play in La Liga or play in the UEFA Champions League. We have clubs in Australian football of national league scale who are basically playing regional, like they're basically playing regional football. Because if we compare it to Europe, we usually have, for example, in strong football countries, let's use Spain as an example, we have La Liga, we have La Liga 2, and then we go into regional football, right? We don't have here a second tier. We're going straight into regional football. So these clubs have gone, for example, from playing National League football with the appropriate infrastructure and fan base to regional football with no opportunity to go back up. If we wanted to give a free hand ball to opposing sports or codes, for example, the AFL, the NRL, who have clubs which started off in the suburbs of Melbourne and in Sydney that are over 100 years old, if we want to give them a free handball and say, we can just wipe away 27 years of history, we can target some of your most historic clubs, we can get rid of Collingwood, we can get rid of Essendon, we can get rid of St. George, we can get rid of any other club that's historic in those codes and expect that code to still be in the same position. I don't think that would be the case. And that's what we did in soccer, in football. We had a national league of 27 years. It wasn't perfect, as Peter said. It had many flaws. Yes, it was part-time, but it still had 4 or 5, 6, maybe more strong clubs, right? Which we just threw away,
And I'll add to that as well, Mike. Yeah. Collingwood was probably one of the worst run VFL clubs at one point. They were broke, they were overspending, they had a lot of issues at their stadium with the fan behaviour and so forth. Imagine the VFL/AFL at the time said, we're going to scrap Collingwood, we're going to build a new team. You just wouldn't do it, right? And they had their problems. Like anyone of my era knows, they weren't very well liked by a lot of people. But you know what they did have? A lot of people that did like them, right? I don't like them, but they do. And that's why they're the biggest club in Australia. So it's not who wouldn't support a football club, it's who would support a football club. And that's the culture we need to build on. I'm never going to be a Melbourne Victory supporter, and certain people are never going to be South Melbourne supporters, but we can grow the game through that rivalry.
How did the club and its fans adapt to this sudden change in status, going all the way from the national tier to regional competitions? Let's start with Mike.
Look, it's been a hard adaptation, I would say. And, again, it's a club with national infrastructure, playing in a regional league. No matter how good the NPL 1 Victoria has gotten, and, it's gotten to a very good level. We saw in the Australia Cup, 3 NPL Victoria teams defeat, 3 A-League franchises in the round of 32, which I know there's various points that can be raised for and against that achievement, but I would never have expected that if there was an equivalent tournament during my time supporting the NSL, that state league teams could achieve that. But the reality is, no matter how good the football level is, you have clubs that are set up to be national league teams. And, as long as they're not playing the National League, that's playing out with, fans losing interest, fans, only attending big matches. It's been 20 years now since South Melbourne's played, at the highest level. When South Melbourne was thriving from, I guess, a National League perspective, they were winning championships, they were producing Socceroos, the crowds were larger. When you rug all that away, it's been a very bumpy ride. I have to give it to the people who have stayed on board, whether that's committee members, volunteers, supporters, because the club has grown during that time. We've got a strong women's program. We've got a strong junior program. We've got an all abilities program. Lakeside Stadium, no matter how the board managed to do it, sure, it's also unfortunately become, well, you could argue it's become also an athletics track, but the stadium was redeveloped. And once again, for the benefit of hindsight, but even it frustrates me because when you had such an asset, which Lakeside Stadium is, and especially was when it was Bob Jane Stadium, basically a boutique football-only venue, very close to the heart of Melbourne, to basically say, no, because South Melbourne, may not fit, the sort of the mold of the new A-League teams that we want. Let's not do everything that we can to include them in the new league. We're happy for them to go away. You're giving up a facility like Bob Jane Stadium. Like, that was football only specific. Like, who are the people involved making these decisions? Like, we know who they were, but like, how were they possibly thinking? So to sort of still be around, to be challenging for titles, National Premier Leagues of Victoria, to have a great run in the Australia Cup last year. And also it's worth mentioning the media team at South Melbourne and many other clubs, they do a great job to still keep the passion and still keep supporters informed in some way. But it's been difficult, is the truth. And I think clubs like South Melbourne, it's not only South Melbourne, they need something else. It's time for them to have something else, some sort of national league, if they're really going to, I would say, 1, survive and 2, flourish again, over the next, say, 10 years.
I look at my kids' generation, right? And there's been a generation loss. Yeah, my kids come every now and again, but they haven't grown up with top flight football and the opportunities that I grew up with. And we've lost at least 1, if not 2 generations of football fans. And I still bump into some of the old fans every now and again who just go to me, well, it's just not the same. I don't come because it's just not the same. It upsets me seeing the club at that level. And at the same time, a lot of people contacting me, some old fans and just some lukewarm fans who really want this national second tier to start. They really see this as an opportunity to reconnect. Some of them had tried the A-League. That just wasn't for them. They didn't have the same love for their old NSL club. So there's a real opportunity. And every day we wait, every year we delay this, and it has been delayed multiple times. It's just continuing to kick the can and the opportunity down the road. And we really just need to get on with it and stop having this protectionist approach to, let's not start a national second tier because we've got to protect the A-League, to actually, let's start the national second tier because we need to grow the game at all levels. And you know what? Ultimately, this should help football, club football across the country, which includes the A-League. So the sooner we start it, the sooner we grow the game, the sooner we get a promotion relegation with the A-League, and the sooner every club in this country, from Tasmania all the way through to the northwest corner of Western Australia, clubs an opportunity to grow and aspire. And that's what we really need right now.
Now, I just want to touch on something that you guys briefly mentioned. Obviously, with the NSL folding and the introduction of the A-League, I feel, particularly in WA, and I know I can't speak for everyone, I understand if you guys can't exactly relate to this situation, or maybe you can. I'm not too sure how the situation over in Victoria is, but a real sort of divide has happened around the A-League. And the reason that Perth, despite being the only club in WA, hasn't really got that big of a supporter base is because a lot of people, especially, Italians or Portuguese people, or even people like, Greeks or Egyptians over here, don't really feel connected to Perth Glory, given that it is a majority English club and, they haven't really made many efforts to sort of tap into any other markets. They do most of their stuff in Perth, and when they do go outside of Perth to promote, it's mostly in Albany or Bunbury, which are majority English settlements outside of the larger Perth area. So areas such as Fremantle with a large Italian population, or even, places like Victoria Park with majority Asian populations aren't exactly included. But one thing I really am interested to know is that obviously with the A-League being announced and replacing the old NSL, it would have had, a big shock go through the system of Victorian football structure. And I'm sure it would have been a massive shock to the system for all domestic areas in terms of their football structure and, MPL leagues and stuff like that. How many fans do you know, or what percentage would you say were at that time looking to sort of leave clubs like South Melbourne and maybe look to more support clubs like Melbourne Victory, like Melbourne Hearts when they did eventually come around? And what sort of effect do you think that had on both the A-League and, I guess, more regional football?
Look, from my perspective, when I was supporting South Melbourne in the NSL, I didn't know anyone that was supporting South Melbourne saying that, I long for something different. I long for a team called Melbourne Victory as an example. I don't think that was a thing, right? I think, unfortunately, there were people who maybe they were vocal, but I actually don't. I think there was, it's a difficult topic, but I think, for example, the mainstream media at the time, again, we didn't have the benefits of social media, the ability to disseminate information like we can now over the internet. So what the mainstream media was focusing on, broadcast networks, newspapers, they were at times, not often, at times, but they would make a big splash of it, highlighting negative situations in football at the time and linking it to, the ethnic backgrounds of clubs. Sometimes, not always, because it's also worth remembering that back in those days, we also had Michael Lynch and Peter Desira writing full time, for the Herald Sun and also the Age, covering football, which is not the case now, right? But, the mainstream media, I think they were invested, for example, in sports, such as the AFL, such as the NRL. They had an interest in trying to protect, these sports. So often, when an incident would happen, they would cover it. And unfortunately, that led to some people, who thought, because the NSL wasn't perfect, which Peter mentioned previously, it did have its flaws. We're not trying to claim it was perfect, but so there were people within football saying that, maybe we need to stop links to being ethnic. But the thing is, we had clubs in the NSL like Northern Spirit. We had Perth Glory, who was an unbelievably successful club in the NSL. They've actually gone significantly downhill in the A-League. I can't believe it. I remember being a South Melbourne fan, looking at Perth Glory, having like 16, 17, 18,000 people regularly to their games in the NSL, week after week, being an absolute powerhouse, dominant team. And now I see them in the A-League. They're just like a shell of their former selves. We even had, a situation like Adelaide United had one season in the NSL, and they've gone the other way where they were strong in the NSL in that 1 year. Obviously, they had that pop of being like a team for Adelaide, and they've continued that now with successful on-field results. And I think are the one example of, like a mainstream one-city team, that seems to be building some momentum. But what I'm trying to highlight is that every situation is different and unique, right? There's no one size fits all. And unfortunately, under the Lowy era, he hired a CEO from rugby union, I believe, who tried to pursue a model of, one team per state. They need to be, I don't know, let's call it mainstream. And, sure, it had that initial pop. We had people who were supporting NSL teams who, okay, they happily went to supporting an A-League franchise for a year or two, maybe many years. But, there's a reason why. We had, for example, Melbourne derbies between Victory and Sydney that had 50,000 people. And then a couple of weeks ago, probably around a month ago, we had Melbourne Victory versus Sydney with 10,000 people. And I think they played again and they got 14,000, but that's a tremendous drop. And we need to ask ourselves why. It's because maybe, creating that big pop and show actually isn't good for the underlying strength of football. Maybe we attracted too many people who just wanted to sample, or casually experience football. We didn't really focus on building, a proper football culture and football fan base. So I've gone probably off on a tangent. I apologize, Alex. I didn't know any people really that wanted to go to the A-League, but they existed. They absolutely existed because they felt that maybe the ethnic element was holding the game back. There were people in Football Australia at the time, I believe, maybe David Hill, who was pushing sort of like, let's try and, let's get rid of, for example, countries in clubs' names. Let's change the logos. So, this sort of movement was happening from that time. I did think it was a little bit peculiar. I was buying into the narrative of, what I was seeing in newspapers and on television occasionally. It wasn't that often. And unfortunately, because that was the main form of media that we had, ultimately, I think those sort of voices influenced a lot of people to move in the complete opposite direction, to cut what we had fully away almost and move to the A-League and basically drop some really big clubs.
What I'd add to that as well is people had the opportunity. It was called Carlton, right? And Carlton offered something different to the traditional clubs, and their crowds were terrible. All right. So it wasn't just, let's say the traditional clubs versus new clubs. There are challenges with football, and there are still the same challenges with football. So we need to find a different way, because we've been trying to mimic and beat NRL and AFL at their own game when we're the biggest sport in the world. So let's go back to basics, build a football culture, and create these opportunities for every club in Australia to have the potential to play top flight football. And as someone who works in an infrastructure area, I can tell you local governments and state governments would be more likely to fund football infrastructure if a club has the opportunity, or their local club has an opportunity to play at the national level. If they will support a Brunswick, let's just say, club that potentially want to be, showed some aspiration and so forth, to be at the NSL, more likely than if the highest level they could achieve is at NPL level. So that is also a tangent from what you said, from what you asked, but it really comes down to the C word, and that's culture.
Yeah, I had this other point as well. I just have this belief, and it's playing out, I think, in the A-League and the MLS, but I believe that if your top tier is basically franchise-based and geared towards the interests of shareholders, as opposed to, football clubs and a football culture, you'll never become the number one sporting league in your country. And the MLS and the A-League, I'm not seeing anything that's resembling challenging the AFL or the NRL. I'm not seeing anything that's resembling challenging, the NHL, the NFL, the NBA. And that's what they're trying to be, okay? They're ignoring what football is, what football culture is, and they're just trying to say we have this model which serves the interests of shareholders and sport, via sport, and via this model we can become number one. I haven't seen it work in football. I'll be shocked if it does, because I look at the countries where it does work, or the regions of the world where it does work, namely Europe and namely South America, and it's totally the opposite of this approach.
I want to move on to the recent years in the NPL. I want to ask Pete on the football culture, how has South Melbourne maintained its identity as well as its fan base in the NPL?
Yeah, good question. Look, the club's done a fantastic job in terms of, look, we've had a couple of bad seasons, but overall competing at a high, for the championship in most years we're in it. And that always, as we spoke about earlier, creates more interest, a greater crowd attendance and so forth. But I think where the club's done a really good job is have such a great connection with the community through its junior and women's program. And I think that's where, I love going to the games and seeing a whole bunch of juniors, both male and female, at our games. Just, sometimes they're not even watching the game. Sometimes they're that kid that's just there kicking the football around beside the stadium or so forth. But really making that connection to the local community in the southeast of Melbourne, I think, has really shaped the club going forward. And it's also by having such a strong junior program and connection with the community, it really places it in a very strong position to rebound when the opportunity comes, because all of a sudden all those kids that have played for the club over these years, who've got mostly, I would assume, a very positive experience from being involved in the club over generations, they've got a reason now all of a sudden to come to more games. They'll eventually become parents, start taking their kids to the games. And I think really that community connection, that local community connection, along with their connection with the old people, like myself, who have held tight and not being wooed to the other side. There's enough of us still around that are connected to the club, which gives the club a real great atmosphere to be around. And I think that's really been the strength of the club. It's the old and the new really coming together and really continue to support the club. And that has come from some great sponsors over the years. And I must say, an amazing board that we've had over the years with fantastic presidents, including current president Nick Marcoussis, who does an unbelievable job to really make sure the club is relevant year on year and growing its footprint.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can add to what Peter said, I think I mentioned it briefly, is like one vital element. Thankfully, the internet and social media has provided, and South Melbourne has captured this opportunity. And that's, keeping fans or potential fans or prior fans involved with the club via our presence on, social media platforms. The media team does a tremendous job, to be fair. I've noticed in recent years as well, we're starting to improve our game in merchandising. There's some really great gear that you can get from South Melbourne. It's a difficult thing because when you're missing, your fundamental, I guess, platform, which is playing football at the highest level, which I believe, that really is what South Melbourne was about. You're going to lose people, like in terms of attending in person, their interest levels, attracting new fans becomes harder. But, as Peter mentioned, I think, the junior programs and also the work of our media team over many, many years is helping. And so is, for example, performing well on the field, doing well in competitions like the Australia Cup. I think the board, and even though it was the second time we reached the semi-final stage, I think the board will prioritise the Australia Cup now because, it kind of sends like a high level competitive energy, through the team. So it's important, I think, whilst not playing at that highest level, that we do well in the Australia Cup. And yeah, all of a sudden you have, I guess, more coverage of the game as well. So at least, if people are not attending South Melbourne games, they can watch on YouTube, or if we're in the Australia Cup, they can watch on 10 Play. These sort of things are helping. But ultimately, I feel if we don't play at the highest level or a high level, it doesn't have to be the A-League, we don't play in a national league, in the next 10 years, it's going to be difficult for clubs like South Melbourne because they're set up to be clubs which are performing at, on a national stage.
So let's talk about the future then. What do you think needs to happen for South Melbourne to return to the top level of Australian football?
Well, I'm going to answer this. It's not just about South Melbourne. I'm going to talk about clubs like South Melbourne. So there's a lot, we're obviously passionate towards our club, but it's not just about our club because our club succeeding is not successful football. We want to see it, but it's not ultimately where we want to be. We want the whole of the game to grow. And the future has to be starting with the National Second Division. That is an absolute must. In my opinion, Football Australia's really let the game down by not starting this earlier, right? I won't go into the details there, but it's been dragging on too long. But we need to start the National Second Division, and we need to have a clear time frame for promotion and relegation, where ultimately clubs can start planning at both the A-League level and at the statewide level for this to occur in the future. Because even if you're not in the first round of the National Second Tier in the next year or two, you should be sending the signal out to every club in the country that this is going to happen and that by the year 2030, let's just say, we're going to open this up to a full promotion relegation. Then it's all on the pitch, all right? Then it's around growing the game, growing the support base for each of these clubs, getting the infrastructure in place, and really focusing on growing a club that is capable of winning and getting promoted to that top tier. Ultimately, I won't be happy until South Melbourne are champions of Asia, right? Right now, all I can hope for is that we're the champions of Victoria, right? That's all we can aspire to. We can't aspire to be anything bigger than that. And I want to be able to go to games where we're winning, first of all, winning the national second tier, getting promoted to the top flight, whether that's called the A-League or whatever it may be. Then I want to compete at the international stage. I want to win the Asia Cup, right? Asian Champions League. That should be the aspiration for every club in Australia. Every club should have that opportunity to aspire, plan, and get the infrastructure in place, the funds in place to be able to achieve that. Now, that's what I want. If South Melbourne aren't Asian champions by the year 2035, I'll be disappointed. That might sound crazy, but that's what I want. I want my club to aspire to be Asian champions. And, that's much better than just being Victorian champions, which we haven't been able to achieve, unfortunately, for a few years. But open it up, create the opportunities, and watch the game grow not just franchises. Let's make this a football competition for all clubs across Australia.
All right. And it's been a very serious talk here. We've covered plenty of good ground from both of you. And once again, we'd like to thank you guys so much for coming on. But we'll end it with one more question, and we'll make it a bit of a fun one. For both of you, this is directed to both of you. Let's say you wake up tomorrow and you're the CEO of South Melbourne. You get a call from the Australian FA and you get offered 3 different choices. You can either join the national second tier and be one of the founding clubs. You can get a spot in the A-League as one of the next expansion clubs, or you can be one of the founding clubs in a brand new Oceanic Professional Football League. Which one would you pick and why?
Look, from my perspective, I think it's a very easy decision. I would choose to enter as a foundation club in the national second tier or the national second division. Probably would be called something else because, we've probably heard the terminology of, if it's not linked to the actual top division, say the A-League, it's not really a second division. So it's something else, but I'd like to be part of that sort of football pyramid within Australia, which I hope would be connected, because it's basically what I've landed on after 20 years. I've basically gotten to a point where I believe that, if we create an aspiration platform, like Peter described, to give every club an opportunity to want more, we will see benefits in football infrastructure. We see it in NPL Victoria, like a club like the Oakley Cannons. They've got a $14 million investment, which is going into like a 500-seat grandstand, media pavilion, entertainment, change room facility. And they're playing in the NPL 1 of Victoria, right? That's a significant investment from local council, from, I think, also federal government and also state government. If clubs like Oakley Cannons or South Melbourne, had the ability to play at a higher level, I think football infrastructure would thrive, right? So when I look at it from a whole of game perspective, and then we break it down to, levels below the second tier, into the NPL, into state leagues, as clubs continuously progress and they have basically a limitless level of progression available to them. I think we see the game improving, at a scale which we're currently not able to replicate, because we currently have a block. We reach the NPL Victoria or the NPL in another state. In some states, like, for example, in Victoria, it's a very good level of football. The football culture is improving. Clubs are improving their facilities, but eventually they're stuck, right? They need something else. So if we create a national league after that, I think that's a sufficient step up, to create enthusiasm, to revitalize really many existing clubs, to allow new clubs to aspire and progress. And that's my choice, because I think that's what's best for Australian football. Unfortunately, over the years, I think, for the sake of honesty, probably over the last 5 or 6 years, when I saw the decision of Western United and MacArthur, led into the A-League over, for example, South Melbourne, that to me was a clear signal that, the A-League, in my interpretation, has no interest in, what's good for Australian football. No disrespect to those teams, but, that's just my opinion. They're just interested in whether it's money, whether it's doing anything they can to avoid, allowing old soccer to come back. I'm not sure what their motivations were, but when I saw that, that was the final nail, which said to me, you know what? The Australian football pyramid is more important than this top tier. So that's my choice, playing in the NST.
I echo everything Mike said and add my first line will be no more shortcuts. That should be Football Australia's motto. No more shortcuts. We've tried shortcuts for too many years, for over 2 decades. We need to build a foundation for club football to grow for future generations. We need to do things differently. And I wanted nothing more for a long time than South Melbourne to be in the A-League and play the top flight. Just to play the top flight, because I always want my club to be, as I said, Asian champions one day, not just Australian champions. But we can't do that anymore. It's not working. I wouldn't want my club to be in a situation where they're playing in a league which I don't think is financially viable. The next TV deal, who knows if they're going to generate any money from it. Let's stop thinking we can fix things quickly for the interests of a few franchise owners. Let's fix the game for all of football, for every club in Australia. And if we have to wait a little bit longer to be Australian champions because we're going to have to go do it the proper way rather than the shortcut, let's do it the proper way and let's grow the game, let's grow the club, and let's, in 30 or 40 years' time, look back and say, wow, the CEO of South Melbourne made some really wise decisions. And that's what even better, the CEOs and the board and management of Football Australia stopped taking shortcuts.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Pete and Mike. I want to end with this one last question. What message would you give to South Melbourne fans and the broader football community?
Oh, look, let's not make it about South Melbourne, just the broader football community. Support any level of football that you can. I think the most accessible level of football is your local club. So, somewhere that you can walk to within 5 or 10 minutes, maybe drive within 2 to 3 kilometres. Get involved, at that level. Watch games, maybe volunteer. If you've got kids playing junior football, see how you can help out at the club, especially if you're someone with knowledge of football. And that's really my message. Involve yourself, to your maximum capacity, which is suitable to you. And I think if we had more people who were focused on, really, especially people that really love football, just really devoting as much time as they possibly could. I understand there are many competing priorities, to the game. And it doesn't have to be, for example, you must support the A-League or you must support South Melbourne. No, it's actually, you must support, in my opinion, or if you can support, to the best of your ability. And I mean going the extra mile, starts with watching a game, but it might be volunteering. It might be becoming a referee. It might be becoming a coach. It might be joining a committee. If you love the game, my message is involve yourself or immerse yourself with a club. And I think if we had more and more people doing this, as opposed to, to support Australian football, you must support the A-League. Oh, hang on a minute. I can make a bigger contribution to Australian football if I support my local club and join the committee, coach, referee, volunteer. I think that's a larger contribution potentially than just supporting the A-League. So that's my message. Support your local club to the best of your ability. And if we had more people doing that, I think the game would be in a better place.
Once again, I agree with everything Mike has said, which probably doesn't surprise people. But what I would add, though, is from a South Melbourne lens, is come and see for yourself. Don't listen to Mike. Don't listen to Pete. Don't listen to those who throw garbage at the club and at the NSL, ex-NSL clubs. Go see it for yourself. Go to a game, experience the atmosphere, experience the hospitality, and if you still don't like it, well and good. But I guarantee you, if you go to a game, you'll be hooked like I was 45 years ago.
That wraps up another episode of Green and Gold FC. A huge thank you to Mike, Pete, and of course all of you listening at home. Today's chat wasn't just about football, it's about the memories, the moments, and the passion that made South Melbourne FC special to so many. Whether you grew up watching the club, have your own stories to share, or just want to talk about where Australian football is heading, we'd love to hear from you. Join the conversation on our forum at greenandgoldfc.com and be part of the discussion. You can also find us at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Just search for Green and Gold FC. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to follow, rate, and share. That's all we have time for today. Until next time, take care and bye for now.